Today we're talking to Dr. Moritz Herle about the genetics of appetite and about emotional eating and eating disorders. Moritz Herle is an MRC Skills Development Research Fellow on Mental Health at King's College London, investigating the extent to which environmental factors might mediate genetic risk for childhood obesity and eating disorders. He has a PhD in psychology from University College London. He carried out under the guidance of the late Professor Jane Wardle and Dr. Claire Llewellyn on the etiology of emotional eating in childhood. He has done previous work for Dr. Nadia Mikali at UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health on a project investigating genetic, metabolic, and early life behavioral risk factors for adolescent eating disorders. We welcome him today. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. It's good to have you all back. And today I've got a very special guest, Moritz. It's really nice to have you here on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Claudia. It's such an honor.
It's an honor for me. Just so that we can put a little background to this, Moritz and I were sort of PhD peers, and he helped me a lot with all my
I tried
my statistical worries. Every single time I had to come across some kind of confirmatory factor analysis or something hideous that happened in my, during my PhD. So thank you.
I really hope I gave you.
Oh, no, you did.
I really hope I gave you the right advice at the time. It was quite a long time ago at this point. So
yeah, you gave me advice even after I'd finished my PhD and when I was still carrying out some stuff. So, I'm very thankful for that. Moritz, we're going to talk about, your heritability studies, emotional eating, and the work that you're doing now with eating behavior, not with disordered eating, anorexia, bulimia, and stuff. But how about we start from the beginning? How on earth did you get into this area?
So it was actually quite random. I never intended to study eating behaviors or anything to do with obesity, but I started a PhD at University College London on depression and anxiety, actually. So I started in a completely different field and department. But then through various unfortunate circumstances, I had to switch my PhD topic. And I was basically a PhD student with funding to do a PhD, but no supervision and no topic. So I was scrambling around what to do. And I was very interested in working with twins. And because of my interest in twin studies, I found Jane Wardle and her twin cohort, which I guess many of you other guests have already talked about.
Yeah.
And I found out about her and what she was doing. And then I was like, I really want to work there because I'm really interested in what she's doing. And then I met with Jane and Claire, and we had a short interview, I guess. And from then onwards, I suddenly was working with, data from babies, but also toddlers. And, so before that I was planning on working more with teenagers and adolescents, more the stuff that I do now. But at that point, I was kind of catapulted into this world. And actually, it's, obviously you really enjoy it. And I actually think it's kind of a joy working in this area because it's so relatable. Like everyone, I was just actually talking about this today to some of my colleagues. It's like, if you study anything to do with food or eating related, everyone has an opinion on it. Everyone always has something to say about it because it's such a it's probably the most important topic of our life. So I don't know. It's just a fun topic to be in. So so this is how I entered it. And at the time, the focus of the work that was happening in Claire's and Jane's work, and also the stuff that you were doing and other people that you've interviewed, it was a lot about the appetitive traits, more like food responsiveness and satiety responsiveness. But there wasn't really anyone at this point in the group working on emotional eating. And I was like, well, my background is psychology, emotions sound good. So that seemed like a good fit. And this is kind of how I then took on emotional over and under eating as my PhD topic.
What's interesting is that what came out of that, I mean, you say you went back to sort of you went into sort of babies and the BBQ world, and then you had like the CBQ, but then you bumped into this sort of like gap in the questionnaires, if you like, with the CBQ, and sort of develop that for use in toddlers. So do you want to like talk a little bit about that before we jump into emotional eating? Or
so I guess so like the CBQ is the childhood version, and then Claire developed the baby version of it, and then you developed the adult version. And then when the toddler version was developed, I actually wasn't part of it. I just used it, but it was developed like for that period. I guess that it is when solid foods are already introduced, but it's not like a kind of more like a full developed diet. So it's kind of that intermediate toddler stage. And when
between 1 and 3.
Yeah, it's like it's a very specific period, I guess, where especially a lot of new stuff gets introduced, like parents trying out new flavors and stuff. So I guess that's why researchers are quite interested in that, because it's like a lot of stuff's happening, developing is really, kids are really growing up really quickly at that time. A lot of stuff's going on. So it's quite important. I think the idea was to have something that's very targeted to that specific age group.
Yeah.
And I know that when they developed the toddler version of the CBQ, they went back to some of the parents and kind of checked some of the items, like does the phrasing of the question items, do they make sense for this period? And there were some, they made some, after various conversations with a few of the parents, they decided to like change the phrasings to make them more age appropriate, which I think was,
and then of course you have to sort of like add, if that's the right word, which it's not necessarily, but the emotional eating traits, or, does food fussiness that work into this, stage, or, what other traits are you really trying to measure here that weren't considered like in the BBQ, but that then are present in the CBQ? So you've got like, what is happening with that developmental stage?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it was a bit of a trial, or I guess to see what kind of makes sense as well. I think, going to the parents, just asking what they thought if these constructs made sense to their children at their age, I think was very useful, especially like talking to various parents like from the cohort. So I think it is. I guess it's like it is like it's the first time that the children will start to express specific like they obviously express preferences as babies as well, but it will become more like they will have more choice, they will have more agency about rejecting something or kind of moving towards something. So I think there's just more agency, because obviously that increases as older that you get. Obviously, once you're an adult, you can kind of eat whatever you want, but it's the beginning of that journey in a way. So I think that's why these things are emotional eating, fussy eating, like they become more observable for the parents at this age, I think. So I think that's, you're right. So I guess it was like, you got the CBQ, you got the BBQ, and then you're like, okay, which ones from the CBQ are appropriate in this kind of intermediate stage? So
and then you've still, I've still got like a little, when you start, because the BBQ, you start at 0 to 6 months, so there's still that window between sort of 6 to 12, which is like so messy. It can be so messy, because you've got what people do with complementary feeding. But anyway, that's
exactly.
like
some parents will breastfeed only at this period, and then only there's like a lot of variation going on. So it's it's very hard.
It's a difficult
kind of a combined
with food
feeding plus it's like it's also like we can talk about a little bit later with emotional eating, but there is also always the struggle of what is the parents and what is the child, and that link is very close the younger the kids are. So I guess there's always this, the parents observe their children and you ask them to answer questions about them, but to what extent are they actually also answering questions about themselves? Because they're the main provider of the food. So they're kind of, they're closely linked behaviors. So I think,
we've been doing a lot of work like that now here. And we've got quite a lot of data, because we've been using the BBQ on the infants, and the CBQT and the CBQ and the mothers. So we've got in quite large populations. So we're in the process of actually, how do you explain, do they have similar repetitive traits, etc.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then you start your PhD and you do all this horrible work. I just call it horrible work because it just makes my brain fry every single time I read one of your papers. But what did you do? What can you do with these twins, and how do you do all the heritability studies?
So, I guess the fun thing about working with twin samples is that they are natural. They're like a random natural experiment that the world has just provided to researchers. So I think it's a fun thing that happens in the world, which is the existence of twins. And twin studies have been around for over 100 years. Probably at this point, it's kind of a traditional research technique in psychology. It has its opponents, it has its fans. It's somewhat always has been, at the forefront of how we think about why people are different. I guess let's put it this way. And I guess the clue behind it is that you have population samples of identical twins who are natural clones, so they are genetically more or less identical. And then you have dizygotic twins who share on average 50% of their DNA, which is the same as regular siblings. Like if you have a brother or sister, that's the amount of genetic similarity you will share them with on average. And so you have this kind of two ways of how you are genetically linked how the twins are linked to each other. But then also you have this extra kind of bit of information, which is that twins are always, born at the same time, in the same family, and that were in the same womb. So like all of the kind of prenatal experience, but also the kind of everything that happens around the birth and early life is very, very similar. And that similarity is the same, no matter if you are a monozygotic twin pair or identical twin pair. So we have sort of a kind of a good grip on the environmental variation, so we can kind of control it. We know not about it because we assume it to be very, very similar. And then for the identical twin pairs, we assume the genetic material to be very, very similar. And we know on average how the non-identical twin pairs are similar to each other. And with that, that kind of set of parameters, we can then use that to our advantage. So I guess in other studies, what you were just describing with, you have children that you follow over time and so on, one of your assumptions is that the data points that you collect between the different people are independent. So the CEBQ score of the child one are not related to the CEBQ of the child of a different child from a different family, because they're two random people. They shouldn't be related to each other.
Yeah.
But in the twin studies, it's different because you expect them to be similar to another because they're from the same family, and also to varying degrees, they have this genetic similarity as well. So you expect them to be similar to another. And that similarity, you use it instead of trying to get rid of it. This is what you are after. You're interested in that. Because the assumption is that if the identical twin pairs, let's say you measure something in the family. So let's say we have our CBQ and we want to know emotional overeating. So the parents measure they report on the emotional overeating of their two twins. And we do this across the whole twin study that we have. And then the kind of basic idea is if the identical twin pairs are more similar to each other on that particular trait, then the dizygotic or dizygotic twin pairs, non-identical twin pairs, then that difference between the similarity of the two twin pairs is telling us something about what are the sources of variation that we have in our observed, the differences in that trait of interest. So doing this and doing some what you call horrible structural equation modeling, it's like a specific, it's a very, again, I guess, twin modeling is just a specific type of structural equation modeling. Structural equation modeling can be used for all different types of things. Confirmatory factor analysis.
That I was just going to say that. Actually, I don't know why I complain so much.
It's basically what you're trying, what you have to I guess the difference is that in our case, we have these related individuals and we have to somehow deal with it. And in this case, we even want to specifically use it to get specific inference out of it, where, you know, you don't have that problem with conformity factor analysis or mediation analysis or what other structural equation modeling you'd like to do. But I guess the bottom line is with these kind of twin designs that I was talked about, you are able to ascertain the degree to which individual differences on your trait of interest, like measures like emotional overeating or BMI or whatever you want to measure, are due to genetic variation or environmental factors. And then these environmental factors are then split into environmental factors that make two individuals in one family more similar to another. So that's things that they share. That's why they're called shared environment. But in the sense is, what are environmental factors that make two members of one family more similar? And then you have the unique environments or non-shared environments, which are environmental factors that make two twins in one family different from another. So you have heritability, and then these two, or genetic factors, and often this is called heritability. So if you read a study about heritability, it is usually derived from a twin study. And then you have the shared and the non-shared environment. And this kind of idea, you can only really get to this if you have studies of populations of twins. And that's why the study that Jane Water set up with Claire, the Gemini twin cohort, is so interesting, because it's families with twins and they were followed straight from birth, and you have all this amazing data on appetitive traits and BMI and so on. So it's like a very unique opportunity to look at these traits in this way, I guess.
Right. So then that's very helpful. Yeah. Really good. Thank you very much for sort of clarifying it.
I haven't talked about it in a while, so I feel a bit rusty. But
no, that wasn't rusty.
Bringing it back.
I think now, no. So then you did like all this twin modeling with about sort of emotional eating, and what did you find? Because I love your work on that. Yeah. You know, because it's just like, well, to us as dietitians, it's like I use it all the time because
it's fun. I think everyone was fairly surprised. But well, so I guess like for context, like for example, the heritability of BMI, you know, even at a young age, there's some genetic contribution to BMI that just increases steadily with age. This is one of the kind of established twin study findings, which is then somewhat replicated by genome-wide studies, so studies that use actual DNA instead of family resemblance. But then if you look at some of the other appetitive traits like satiety responsiveness or food responsiveness, there's already some indication that genetic variation is important for these traits at that young age. So that means that identical twin pairs are a lot more similar to each other than non-identical twin pairs, which is by extension the indication of the heritability. But when it comes to emotional eating, so the way emotional eating is measured in Gemini is that it's part of the CBQ toddler version and part of the CBQ child version. And it's split into two separate domains of emotional eating. So one is emotional overeating, which is eating more in response to negative emotions, or boredom. So it's boredom, negative emotions kind of together. And the other one is eating less. So that's emotional undereating, which is kind of the neglected step sibling of emotional eating, because no one really ever talks about it. People don't find it as interesting, but it is there. And people do it, but it's not studied as much. Because I guess, the context within emotional eating studied is often related to weight gain or obesity in general, or maybe depression or binge eating, which all involve eating more. And people necessarily think about emotional, well, different topic, but someone could do a whole project on emotional undereating. To this day, unresearched. So if someone's looking for something to do,
you did research it.
I did some of it, So the first couple of studies in my PhD looked at establishing the heritability of emotional overeating in toddlerhood, and then at 5 years with the child, with the CBQ. And really interestingly, in kind of contrast to the other eating behaviors, the heritability of emotional overeating and emotional undereating is actually very low. So it's, I think it's estimated at around 5%, where let's say something like food responsiveness, I think is maybe as the heritability, maybe it's 40%.
Yeah.
So like it's a lot lower, and the majority of the variance is explained by these shared environmental factors. So these are things that happen that make two members of one family more similar to another. So obviously, in 5-year-olds or even in 1.5-year-olds, the things that happen in your family are probably something that your parents do. So it is somewhat pointing towards something that's happening within the family context that might be important here for the variation in emotional overeating and emotional undereating. So I guess, can you blame your parents? I would say, no, don't ever blame your parents, but maybe. No, I'm not, obviously don't blame. There is, so there seems to be something going on in the family environment that contributes to the variation of emotional overeating, which...
I mean, it got a lot of press.
A lot of press, but it's also like, in a way, like you can see it as a good thing, because that means that there is a way that this is really an opportunity for parents to support their children. Do you know what I mean? So it's not necessarily bad. It's just,
so take away the blame, but it's an open window.
It's empowering, I guess you could argue.
Well, I mean, it's an open window for good, intervention, basically, and I think so. Stop giving your giving treats to your children so that they
this is then the next question,
vegetables.
Right? So like, what is it then? So what do parents do that might inspire children to engage more in emotional overeating? So I guess it's like the next question then. So we identify the kind of family environment. So then what are the things that parents commonly do? And as you said, it's like maybe using food as a reward, using food to soothe a child when it's very upset. And I think, it's very common that parents do that. I mean, it works. That's why you do it, because, there's many reasons why, but I guess it's about finding other strategies or thinking about it in a different way. Like, is there, how you use food as a tool for parenting that is outside of eating. Yeah. So I guess it's kind of like that. Like I think just thinking about it will highlight various instances where that might happen.
Yeah, but not blaming the parents as well, because there's a lot going on. That a lot happens if you do that as well.
I mean, that's
as parents, we feel really guilty anyway. Anytime, just anything that has to do with child feeding makes us feel bad, because it's so complex.
And I guess, I think I would say all parents try. They have the health of their children at their forefront of their mind. They really want to do as best as possible. So, and I think it's just helping people along on the way. And I think it's also important that emotional overeating and undereating aren't strange things. Like, it's very common. Everyone does that as adults. It's just very common. It's just something that we do because, eating delicious things makes you feel good. So it's very normal to do that. It's just a thing that people do. And it's just about finding that balance of, doing that and then maybe not overdoing it. But
even just around COVID, it's become such a subject. It's emotional overeating increased, or I'm an emotional eater. It's like, hang on a second, my position on it has been right now, we're all emotional eaters. Let's relax. Because there's a very big difference between being an emotional eater and then taking that to maybe what's been the next stage of your research, which is,
so I think
eating disorders.
I think it's very important to somewhat differentiate that emotional eating is just the kind of you eat in response to the negative emotions, or maybe it also includes things to when you're happy to celebrate, it's not just that, it's just, the way our mood can change our appetite, and that's just what happens. And you maybe use it to cheer yourself up, or maybe I think it's just when I started working on emotional eating, it was just so funny to me because emotional eating is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere, but it's also kind of nowhere. So it's like you have all these tropes, like Bridget Jones sitting on the sofa after the breakup with the ice cream, eating, there's so many images or kind of cultural ideas about emotional eating. Or obviously we have birthday cakes to celebrate, it's so part of it's everywhere. But then, there's I don't know, there must be probably like 100 books about how to stop being an emotional eater, or like emotional eating is seen as the main cause for obesity or for depression. Like it's so huge, but actually it's like, because it's so like everywhere, it's like kind of hard to pin down in a way, or it kind of becomes a bit, it's almost too general. So I think,
and again,
everywhere.
Would you say that it was, I mean, I sort of think of it as more of like a spectrum in a way. So you've got, like what level of emotional, or what degree, and how do you get into like the more pathological sides of it? And that's,
I think,
to me, that's kind of like, I see it more of, as a spectrum.
I think so, yeah. So I think like people have studied emotional eating like with animals. So there's some like lab study with mice where they kind of stress out the mice and then see how much they eat. Quite horrible, but this is the stuff that they've done. And there's some idea that if it's like an intense kind of 1 point stressor, like I think the electroshock or like pinching the tail, that the appetite, like the amount of food that the mice will eat, goes down. But then if it's like a long-term, low-level kind of stressor, let's say like noise, constant noise, actually this overeating might start to happen. So there might even be some sort of like fight or flight kind of thing. If you're in this like intense amount of stress, your body is like, now it's not the time to eat because you've got other things to worry about. But maybe if you're on this low-level kind of stress, it kind of, a bit like a pandemic, I guess, kind of slips away at you, then maybe the slow kind of grazing gratification of overeating might actually really be like quite soothing. So I guess it also depends a little bit of what the stressor is that we are talking about. And I think the majority, the kind of intense stressors, I mean, you observe them. I don't know, I guess there's some studies who looked at like soldiers. I think they, for example, tend to undereat.
Yeah.
Because they're like in this kind of battle situation. But
yeah.
I think, like being in a lockdown is kind of a classic example of like a low-level stressor that's continuous.
Yeah. Interesting.
Maybe some peaks of anxiety. So I think for your question about like when it becomes like disordered eating, so I think binge, so like I guess we have emotional eating, and then there's people who might disagree with this way of seeing it, but in my head it's emotional eating is this one thing, and then you have binge eating, which is also which is the kind of more pathological or more this psychopathological way, which is part of the binge eating disorder kind of, diagnosis, what is the core behavior. And here it's eating a large amount of food in a very short period, and with the sense, which is the important bit, is there needs to be the person has a sense of they don't have a control over it anymore. So it's this kind of eating like a lot of food that is, I guess you would consider to be unreasonable to eat in this short space of time, like the calorie density, I guess, but also feeling like you can't stop. And that's something quite different in my head, to emotional eating. Yeah. I think there might be linked, and one might be could be maybe a precursor, or like could be, maybe you have binging periods and then maybe you don't, and in the meantime maybe you do some emotional eating, and then maybe a bit. So they're not completely separate things. I'm not saying that, but only because you have a tendency to emotionally eat doesn't mean that you're binging. They're not quite the same.
Yeah. That's why I mean that I kind of,
it's a disservice to people who actually have binge eating disorder.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so as well. That's why I don't know. I think of it in this continuum, because they are sort of different entities. So you can't generalize about it to everybody about emotional eating. It doesn't work.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't do that.
So now tell us about all the work that you have been doing on binge eating disorders and anorexia and bulimia.
So when I finished
when
I finished my PhD, I started working for a psychiatrist called Nadia Mekali, who is currently the head of the child adolescent psychiatry in the main hospital in Geneva. And her main focus as a clinician, but also as a researcher, is eating disorders, and thinking about what are the risk factors to why some children are more likely to develop eating disorders or disordered eating symptoms, in adolescence. And she's brilliant. She's done a lot of amazing work on this, on these various topics. But I guess it was also interesting because I was coming from the, let's say, appetite obesity world, and she's fully in this kind of eating disordered eating world. And it was about like, also had a lot of conversation, a bit about what we just had about emotional eating and binge eating. Like, the two worlds are so linked in some ways, but also they're kind of seen as separate because basically different people study them. Like you have pediatricians and psychiatrists, you have the kind of appetite, geneticists, psychologists, like they're actually in some weird way haven't really worked together as much as you might think, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. I was quite surprised when we was trying to read about, okay, what is actually the link of eating behaviors and, eating disorders? Like someone should have looked at that, but actually not that many people have. I mean, there's like one reason is because these two fields haven't really talked as much to each other as they should have. And then also you need studies
to each other. They haven't talked to each other.
Yeah, they could have talked to each other a bit more. I think they are doing it now. I think it's more coming together now. And also you need studies that follow kids from childhood into adolescence and then to adulthood. So these kind of long-term studies are quite expensive and take time to actually, the kids actually need to become teenagers and become adults so you can follow them. So, it takes some effort to do this. You need someone people who in the study teams so consider it to be a priority to actually study these phenotypes. So it's like there's a lot of reasons I think why none of that stuff has been done. But yeah, so with her, we looked at eating behaviors during childhood and how they relate to disordered eating, like binge eating or excessive exercise, which is kind of the non-eating part of the eating disorders, compensatory behaviors, and purging, so that's like vomiting or using laxatives, binge eating, and then fasting, which is not eating at all for 24 hours. So it's not going on a diet, it's like, I'm not going to eat for 24 hours. So it's quite, in my opinion, I wouldn't be able to do it probably.
No,
my food responsiveness levels are very, very high.
Yes,
if I would fill in your eating behavior questionnaire, my food responsiveness score would be like at the top. I don't know what it's 5.
Intermittent fasting seems to me like a nightmare as well. That's how bad my food responsiveness is as well. Just not eating it isn't, because it's just, it is really difficult to think of these, diseases, and we are talking about psychiatric, diseases, and how, I find it really, I've worked a lot with eating disorders. I find it really difficult to put yourself in those shoes and try and understand. So what did you find? Yeah.
So we were looking at longer. So like in the data set that we're looking at, so this was not with the twins, this was with the general population sample of unrelated children. They're all from the Bristol area, which is like in the, near Wales, like on the west of England. And they were similar to Gemini, they were all followed from early on. And so I think the first data collection is like the first couple of years, and then it kind of gets, they get measures every couple of years. And now they're born all in it's also called Children of the 90s study. So they're now, so if you were born in the 90s, you're like a little bit younger than me. So you're like 30 or late 20s.
Late 20s.
Yeah. And so they were followed, and they're still being followed up. So the data collection is continuing there. So it's like this really rich data source, and they measure all different types of things. And luckily, they also have some measures of eating behavior across childhood. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is with these big cohorts. There's always a fight, a scramble on, what items gets added to the questionnaire, because you can't make it too long. You can't, everyone has different priorities. So there's some measures of eating behavior in there, and it's actually measured, I think, 8 times in the span of 1 year to 10 years. So it's actually quite often. So that's kind of quite nice. And by having this information, we were looking at longitudinal changes. So how do kids change across these first 10 years of life? And we describe these different trajectories, and the focus is it's overeating. So is the child eating more than they're supposed to? Under eating, which is are they eating less than they're supposed to? And then the third domain is fussy eating. So are they quite choosy, quite picky? They only want to eat specific things. And the three kind of main domains. And we looked at how these three domains change across the 10 years. And once we've described those, we then looked at, are there specific patterns of childhood eating behavior that put you at are somewhat associated with your disordered eating when you're a teenager. So then on the flip side, basically we have the first 10 years and we have a little break, and then at 16-year-olds, they rate their own, disordered eating behaviors. So binging, fasting, the ones I just talked about. And we're interested to see, is there a link between these two sets? I guess two kind of important stages of development. So you've got like the early 10, the first years, and then you have like the teenage years. And we found some interesting things. So like the kids who were kind of continuously eating always a little bit too much, like the overeaters, let's call them, they were a little bit more likely to engage in binge eating when they were teenagers. And the undereaters, the ones who were kind of high, like they're always like not very hungry children, I guess, don't have appetite. Maybe
low appetite. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, I'm just trying to remember now. Yeah, so they what were they? Hold on. So I think they were a little bit more likely to engage in this kind of fasting type behaviors, which is kind of intuitive. You imagine, if you are not that interested in food and you don't have, that big appetite, you also might find it easier to even engage in something like not eating for 24 hours.
Yeah.
And I think the most interesting things were the fussy eaters, because fussy eating, I don't know if you have someone talking about fussy eating on the series.
Yes, a bit. Andrea has touched a bit on it, obviously.
Yeah. So like fussy eating is like something that's very common in childhood. So like almost every child will be a fussy eater at some point, because it's just new flavors, new textures, new stuff going on. It's all a bit much. We don't want that. So stuff will get rejected, and it's like a thing that happens. I guess every child has like, oh, I didn't like broccoli, or I didn't eat, I only ate potatoes for half a year, whatever. It's these kind of stories that probably most people know of themselves or of their own children, or family members or friends. So like that's quite common. But then there's some kids who kind of remain a little bit more fussy than their peers. And in the analysis that we found is that the kids, so there were like two separate kind of fussy eaters. There were ones who were fussy eaters from the beginning, and they remained fussy eaters. And there were some who were not fussy. And then, by age 3, 4 is when these new, food stuff gets introduced. They became more fussy, like all of them, but they kind of stayed there. So they didn't, where the other kids, the majority, were a little bit fussy, and then they kind of go over it. And the other ones, there were some who were fussy all the way through, and there were some who became fussy and kind of stayed fussy. And these two ones where we saw this like slight risk increase for anorexia. So there's something about the fussy, there's something, this tendency to be a bit more fussy that maybe then kind of promotes this fasting behavior, or the kind of controlling behavior that is kind of part of anorexia. I mean, these associations are very small. It's not like every child that's fussy and remains fussy will become anorexic. That's what I'm saying. It's like there are small associations that put you like a little bit more at risk of becoming, developing anorexia nervosa. I mean, it's a 2% risk increase, so it's very, very small.
Yeah.
Anorexia nervosa is very rare. So I think for everyone's listening to this, they're very rare illnesses. So you don't have, people do develop these illnesses, and they can be very severe, but they're very rare. So,
and I think that's really important to put into context, because otherwise it just gets, again, it's like, the emotional eating.
Yeah, it's like, fussy eating and emotional eating, these are all things that are fairly common. I would call them, normal. I mean, I don't really like to say things are normal, but like it's quite common. We'll engage with them. Most adults, when they had a bad day, might buy themselves like their favorite dessert to cheer themselves up, or they're still don't like olives. I don't know, there's some certain things people don't like that much. This is all like fussy and emotional eating, but these are just things that happen. And then there's the things that are more in the kind of illness spectrum, which are kind of separate. But it was interesting to see that there was some kind of tracking, I guess, like certain things that kind of started early on, that there's some links to the later ones. Because the reason why that is important to know is that even though eating disorders can be very severe and can have lifelong effects on the individuals and their families, they're quite badly understood. Like the research on it is that, there's no medication for any of them. There's medications for depression or schizophrenia, and there's treatment plans, and some of them work quite well, some of them could work a little bit better, but it's still not very much known about the origins of it. So I think we were looking at this into some sort of behavioral links for other people with genetics or metabolic factors, and so there's all different stuff going on. But I think the reason why people are interested in this is because it's actually not that well known, and so I think that's why that was important.
Right. I was really interested in your results when they came out. What are you doing now?
So I'm doing loads of different things, but I think most in the context of this actually is kind of related a little bit to what I was just talking about. So next year in January, I will start a new project on Gemini actually. So I'm going back to my roots. But so now the Gemini kids are not kids anymore. They're actually teenagers, which is quite terrifying. 14. So there's a new wave of data that's just coming in, and also focusing now more on the disordered eating things like binge eating and fasting and the kind of things that we just talked about. And in my new project, the idea is that, so if we talked about Gemini has collected all these measures across the first 10 years of life, and we've got all the stuff on eating behaviors, we've got their heights and weights, loads of stuff's being collected, physical activity, some personality stuff about the parents, like all of it. And in this new project, we will try to basically use instead of using twin analysis or using some sort of more hypothesis driven, like, okay, we're interested in the parents, what they're doing, we're just gonna throw everything into a huge prediction algorithm. So we're gonna just throw all the data in that we've got and try to let the computer, in a way, let the algorithm see which of the things we're gonna put in, like all the variables that we've collected, which are the ones that come out as most predictive of our outcomes of interest. Because we're trying to look for some new hypotheses, look at some new pathways. And as I just said earlier, it's like eating disorders are still quite badly understood. So maybe the things that we might think of are not the right ones. Maybe we need to look at different ways of studying and making it a bit more hypothesis free. So I guess trying to see what the numbers will tell us, and then that will help us to generate some new hypotheses. So this is the new stuff that we're going to go do next year, so in 2022. And
hang on, just again, what are you going to try and predict? Or is that
disordered eating?
Disordered eating, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So this will be the first time that the kids will report themselves on if they struggle with any of these disordered eating behaviors, like binge eating and fasting. And we want to see which of this vast array of data that we have of them, which are the pathways that are coming out of as interest. So we can then kind of look at them in more detail. But because maybe we will find some combination of variables or specific pathways that we haven't considered yet, because many of the theory that this kind of research is based on is quite outdated at this point, or was very prominent in a specific period of time for other different reasons. And I think it needs kind of like a refresh a little bit.
Yeah, that'll be really, really, I look forward to that. Are you going to use self-report, ABQ?
I think it's been, it
was collected by the parents. It was collected.
It was by the parents,
I tried to ask them to see if they could,
I think they're too young, maybe, for this.
Yeah, they probably are. I think they were, especially when it was collected, which was
so it was
12,
collected
13.
12, 13. So I think,
we'll see. Maybe when they're older as well, and then you can carry on tracking them.
Yeah, exactly. So I think
Yeah.
the idea is to keep it going. I mean, it's a question of money, but
yeah, we did a bit of that. I'm trying to get that work done. We did an MSc just on first year university
students. Yeah,
and we've got.
It's always really interesting to go to these transitional moments.
Yeah.
For many, it will be like the first time they like live by themselves, maybe. So like it is this transitional moment where stuff is changing. So it's like a nice,
natural study with lots of very complicated variables as well. So we found some relationships as well between ABQs and disordered eating. So
definitely.
It's really interesting topic. Well, is there anything else that you would like to I don't believe that, but hey, I'll take it. Thank you so much, Moritz, for being here with us, and for being able to sort of like open up this subject, which I think you put really well, because emotional eating is prickly. It's a difficult subject. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm going to leave your Twitter so that people want to get in touch with you, and I'll also put links to some of your papers as well, that or maybe you're just your Google Scholar, and that way they can read whatever they want, and that would be better. Saves me from having to pick the ones I think are the right ones. Moritz, thank you so much. And also, I just want to say what I say to everyone every time we meet up is, we continue to nourish each other, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might be interested in listening to it. And don't forget to leave a little click, put a click, and leave, fingers up and say, yes, we enjoyed this. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.